Good evening. My name is Ricky Miller, and this is in Principles of Disaster Management. I am currently a student at Liberty University, uh, and this class is Intro into Disaster Management under the tutelage of Professor Johnson. Quick intro: I am a law enforcement officer. I have been in the law enforcement profession since 2007, where I've done everything from school resource officer to patrol, contracted for a short time with the FBI. I've been in charge of SEPTED, and so disaster management is something I've been involved with, but until this class and this presentation is not something I was deeply aware of and understood. So through this presentation, it's geared more towards a law enforcement sense. A lot of the presentation is just prompts for me to talk about in different areas to dive into, but through this presentation, we want to go over the overview of disaster management, prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery, and then a biblical sense and aspect to emergency management. So what is emergency management? It's the use of mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery strategies to limit and prevent disasters. Quick history of emergency management. It's always kind of been around. When people knew floods were coming, they would do things to try to save their crops, so on and so forth. But as far as the United States goes, it didn't really take hold until around World War II. The fear that we were going to be air raided and air bombed by Nazi Germany is really what set that into play. Civil defenses and towns were practicing blackout drills and other things to harden their target. This carried over to the Cold War after World War II, when there was fear of being bombed during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nuclear silos, nuclear shelters were built, so on and so forth. In the 1960s and 1970s, the United States started to really see an influx of disasters that ravished the country. And so in 1979, President Jimmy Carter created the branch FEMA, the Federal Emergency Response Agency, Federal Emergency Management FEMA Agency, and they kind of pulled together a bunch of other resources that was all separated and kind of made it under one distinct unit of the federal government. And then disaster management took a big turn. Emergency management took a big turn September 11th, 2001. The terror attacks at the World Trade Centers and the Pentagon made terrorism, not that it wasn't a real thing, but it had affected us. So the Department of Homeland Security was created. 2003, FEMA became a part of Homeland Security, and they were directed to make sure local law enforcement could understand how to respond, were properly trained, understand how to deal with weapons of mass destruction, along with chemical weapons. And as things have evolved to today's time, in 2020, cyber warfare is becoming to the forefold. Now we're starting to try to defend against cyber attacks, along with everything else prior: terrorist attacks, hurricanes, tornadoes, so on and so forth. So disaster management. Disasters, there's two types of disasters: a sudden catastrophic event that brings damage, loss, and destruction. There's two distinct types of disasters: natural disasters and man-made disasters. Natural disasters include hurricanes, tornadoes, tsunamis, landslides, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, flooding, avalanches, massive sinkholes, anything that produced by nature that is pretty much unavoidable, but there's things we can do to limit their effect on an area. Human-caused disasters: nuclear power plant failures, Chernobyl, terrorism, oil spills, forest fires that ravage the West Coast and even out in the Shenandoah Valley. Campfires that are left unattended that just burn thousands and thousands of acres of forest. Disasters since 2006 through 2015 have cost approximately $1.5 trillion in economic damage. They've claimed the lives of approximately 750,000 people and have affected 2 billion others in that time frame. That's quite a lot. It's every year you've probably known someone or somebody's been affected by some sort of disaster, whether it's flooding, tornadoes, hurricanes, powerful storms, whatnot. So, getting into those steps, how do we, in emergency management, how do we go about preventing an unavoidable disaster? Well, you can't prevent it, but there's things that you can do to hinder it or make it less. Prevention itself means the act of avoiding or hindering. Natural disasters, like I said, are not avoidable, but there are steps and techniques that you can put in place to limit their effectiveness as far as disaster and destruction to a particular area. And we'll get into those later. For man-made disasters, they are avoidable with proper mitigation techniques such as information collection, proper communication amongst law enforcement agencies to locate terror threats, stop cyber attacks, and constantly staying aware. Awareness and communication is one of the best ways to stop a man-made disaster. As far as oil spills and power plant failures, Chernobyl, the biggest issue with Chernobyl was they knew there was a malfunction with that reactor. They never did anything about it. Thus, it went unchecked. Worst nuclear disaster probably ever. Mitigation. Mitigation is the act of lessening something, state of being mitigated, the process, result of making something less severe, dangerous, painful, harsh, or damaging. For example, most people know Sandy Hook shooting. Where I'm at in Shenandoah County, we have an SRO in every building, hardening the target. They've gone from that, having a school resource officer in every building, to locking all the doors, reinforced glass around the entrances, more awareness and education, kind of harden that target for reinforced walls, for places that suffer more wind damage, hurricanes and tornadoes, etc. Mitigation is basically you see a problem, you identify a problem, whether it's through a tabletop exercise with all community members and emergency management members, or just somebody says, hey, that could be a potential problem, we should get that fixed, knowing that an area might flood, there are constantly floods, and trying to work on ways to divert the water, so on and so forth. Preparedness. Preparedness is a set of pre-event actions that are developed to increase social ability to respond to natural and man-made disasters. For first responders, preparedness is trainings such as active shooter trainings, having a good emergency response plan. Those show areas such as triage centers, places where helicopters would land, places to take people who are being evacuated, cutoff points, access points, reunification points, so on and so forth. For civilians, just having a go bag, having extra food, water, medical supplies handy. In the wintertime, having extra blankets and things in the car, having extra gas available. For businesses and schools, running disaster evacuation drills, understanding what to do in an emergency. I brought up Sandy Hook a little while ago. When the Sandy Hook shooter came in, the students actually, when they were evacuating the school, ran their fire drill route out the building and went right back in front of the windows where that shooter was actually shooting in the school. So having specific drills for active shooters and muscle memory is key to what to do in certain situations. Planning. The planning phase, emergency response is designed to help everyone at an organization decide on a suitable action in response to different emergencies. The planning phase has 3 different types of emergency management focuses: mitigation, response, recovery planning. These planning phases, you have mitigation, which finds and identifies problems, response planning, how are we going to respond, and then recovery planning, what do we do after, how do we fix it. Different types of these types of planning where how to evacuate, how do we transport all these people, how do we get the people out who can't be transported, having extra sandbags available for areas where there could be storm surge, such as in Florida. They're constantly putting sandbags around businesses to try to divert water, boarding up windows to stop debris from storm when the storms start blowing and tree branches start flying, and storm shelters for tornado warnings. So mitigation planning. Focus on identifying local hazards, assessing the probability of where and how hazards could harm people, places, and deciding the best possible way to reduce their potential impact. So, for example, Walmart, they have these cement poles in front to stop vehicles from being able to drive right through and harm civilians or break down their doors. This design is as terrorism started focusing on quick attacks, going from bombings to jumping out random stabbings or driving cars into markets. That's kind of why these are designed. Schools are down, locking all doors, having to buzz to get in to make sure unwanted people can't get into the buildings. Propane tanks. For example, we had a tabletop exercise around one of the schools, and they had a propane tank like that was next to the school, was completely unblocked. So they decided to put these type of pillars around it so a car couldn't drive right into it, causing an explosion and a massive problem at that particular school. So those are just some mitigation strategies. Identify the problem, put up the barriers around it so a vehicle or debris couldn't fly and hit that and impact it during an emergency situation. Emergency response planning. Focus on a consistent emergency operation plans that focus on best practices to help a situation coordinate activities such as warning the public, search and rescue, rapid restoration of services and utilities. Evacuation shelters, evacuation and sheltering, special needs. What do you do with the special needs community? Those members of the community are very dependent on emergency responders and their caretakers to move them to a safe location. Where are you going to do that? How are you going to do that? Hospitals. How are we going to get the people out? During Hurricane Katrina, that was a big issue. There was no real plan to do that until the very last minute, and the hospitals just decided to stay open. Well, when the levees broke, the area got flooded, and the hospitals were being overrun, but A, they had no power because the flooding blew out their generators, and B, all the people that couldn't evacuate were rushing to the hospitals for help. If you do have evacuation, make sure gas stations have extra gas. That was also that becomes a big problem. They'll order evacuations, and then gas stations are running out of gas, jacking up prices, price gouging, so on and so forth. Recovery planning. There's two basic parts. Pre-event recovery focus on to restore the community normality. Post-event recovery is more typical. Unfortunately, it takes longer to conduct and implement. Recovery planning is harder because most areas do not budget financially for disasters. They have smaller incomes. They don't bring in as much tax revenue. So with demands of the public, that money's first to go. Places like Los Angeles do, however, they deal with earthquakes more often, but that can make it also post and pre-recovery can be extremely difficult because they require the federal government to step in and assist financially. Response. The main goal of response, saving lives. No matter, all the good plans in the world can help with this, but at the end of the day, fire and rescue, law enforcement, medical teams, volunteer organizations, saving lives is the number one priority of the response phase in emergency management. Getting people out who are stuck and left or in danger. The response will start right before, during, and right after a disaster is struck. This is where first responders go into action. And a biblical mindset of first responders, Isaiah 6:8. And I heard a voice say, the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send? Who will go for us?" That's what these people do. They go without regard for their own safety, without regard for their family, and they just want to help and do what's right. Response. During response, you have search and rescue, you have mobile emergency communication centers put up. Usually they're in a big van that can drive around with all the powering and antennas to transmit over the radios so that talking can be, communication can be key, because you have to, once you locate people that need to be evacuated, you then have to figure out, okay, once you get them, where are they going to go? Triage centers. This is when triage centers get set up at different areas, depending on the disaster and where there's power. Transportation. Excuse me, can you please turn that light back on? Thank you.